Gravitas, co-presented by Skoda. Kushaq, choose what really matters.
Hello and welcome to Gravitas USA Direct. We are coming to you live from across the White House, where preparations are on in full swing to host India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He's scheduled to land in the United States in 3 days from now. He'll be in the US Capitol, and we are here to tell you all about the build-up, what to expect from the upcoming bilaterals, the first ever in-person Quad meeting. And today we're starting with history, the Cold War to be precise. Back then, India believed in non-alignment, meaning the refusal to take sides between two opposing blocs. India refused to take sides with either the Soviet Union or the United States. New Delhi chose to maintain neutrality. As years passed, India adopted strategic partnerships, alliances based on strategic convergence. You can say that India has exhibited diplomacy relevant to the era. Now is the era of the Wuhan virus pandemic. It calls for clear definitions, defining the good from the bad, the allies from the adversaries. You cannot operate in ambiguity. You cannot exhibit hesitancy. These definitions, these lines can help shape new dynamics, new alliances based on convergence, and a future leadership role based on creative diplomacy. So this is the question that we're asking today. Is India ready to define its allies and adversaries? Joining me in our Washington studios is Patrick M. Cronin. He's the Asia Pacific Security Chair at Hudson Institute, also former senior advisor and Senior Director of the Asia Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. And before that, a Senior Director of the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. Also with me is Atman Trivedi. He is the Managing Director at Hills & Company. Atman has been U.S. Special Envoy on Climate John Kerry's Council on India and Southeast Asia. He has also served as the Chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Gentlemen, welcome to Gravitas.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We are calling this panel discussion India, Allies and Adversaries, and there's a reason why we want to start with this. Many believe that for India to expand its global footprint, it must clearly define its allies and adversaries. Do you agree?
I think India in the last few years has begun this process of definition that you're talking about. And in part, that's a response to the external environment in which it's dealing with. The biggest development may have been the situation in the high Himalayas, of course, the conflict that broke out in the Galwan Valley about a year ago, and the subsequent tensions that still linger with China. And so I think that has hastened a natural alignment with the U.S. and the West on a number of different issues. So here, when the Prime Minister comes, I think we'll see that the sides are seeing more eye to eye than that they ever really have. Here in the U.S., there's strong bipartisan support, Democrat and Republican, for the U.S.-India relationship.
Patrick, they say in diplomacy there are no permanent allies or adversaries, there are only permanent interests. And yet, can those interests be served well if you do not clearly define or spell out who your adversaries are?
Well, you better have your objectives clearly in mind if you hope to pursue them and achieve them. And there's no doubt that over the last year, largely because of China's actions, the quadrilateral security partners of India, Japan, Australia, and the United States have moved in closer alignment, not just the problem solving of vaccines or supply chain security, but I think maritime security and other questions that get into the hard security realm, where everybody's been wary of making this a formal alliance. It's not heading there yet. But if China keeps pressing India and Australia and Japan and the United States, who knows where this could end up? I think we're seeing a new variable geometry in the Indo-Pacific. The quadrilateral security arrangement is just one mechanism, but it's sort of a muscular hub for maritime democracies who pose a latent threat. That is, if they were to come together seriously as an alliance in future, they would be a dominant security apparatus. But there are other minilateral, trilateral arrangements that are obviously brewing. Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States is one, but Japan, Australia, the US, and so on. And these arrangements are all trying to achieve specific goals, problem solving. Whether it's the maritime security, the Malabar exercise that India has helped to lead with others, or whether it's the submarine deal with Australia and the UK, These are specific questions, and the Quad is still focused on delivering on specific challenges like, again, vaccination. If they can help the world get vaccinated, not just Southeast Asia, that will be a huge public good for everybody, and it's not at China's expense. It's for the good of the world. So it's not all about adversaries, but it is definitely knowing about what your objectives are.
And yet the Quad, since you mentioned the Quad, has not been able to clearly define and spell out what their objectives are. You mentioned the Malabar exercise. It took forever for India to get Australia on board.
Yes.
So when we're talking about alliances, and then we have the US, you said that there's a lot going for this alliance, but we know how things are going between America and one of its oldest allies, France, at the moment, and especially under Donald Trump, but even with Joe Biden as president, I think there's been a lack of confidence in America as an ally at some level. So what should India be looking at when it sets out to define who is an ally and how much you're prepared to give?
Well, I think, as Patrick rightly pointed out, it's a question of being clear about what India's interests are. But, when you're talking about security, prosperity, the U.S. is still very much the partner of first choice, I think, in the world. What the U.S. can offer in terms of defense capabilities, technological know-how, the ability to work together on shared economic issues and encourage prosperity through working together on trade. I think there's just a tremendous amount there that is on offer from the United States. And, the U.S. has come to the assistance of India quietly during some of its challenges with China. There have been very robust consultations that have taken place in the last few weeks regarding Afghanistan and our shared concerns about counterterrorism. I think when the United States has a national interest at stake, you can count on the United States to be a credible, faithful ally and partner.
You mentioned defense. I think a test of that would be once the S-400 missile defense system is delivered, and will CATSA be invoked against India or not? That's one of the questions that's being asked there. But if we talk about China, for instance, China and India have not had the best of times over the last couple of years, and yet China remains the biggest trading partner for India. How do you navigate the two when you're bracketing countries as allies or adversaries, or should you be content with calling some just competitors?
Well, I think China is complicated, and therefore it can't just be a competitor. It can't just be a state you're looking for trade and cooperation from either. And it's not all about confrontation, but sometimes there needs to be some confrontation, as there was on the border, India fighting back for its own sovereignty when China's pushing on its frontiers, because they're testing to see whether from the South China Sea or the Himalayas, whether others will push back. That's where the alliance doesn't have to be a sharp choice. It's a matter of standing for the rules-based system and saying, hey, we're four maritime democracies who share common interests. We all want trade relations with China, but let's not be overly dependent on China, especially when it comes to the most sophisticated high technology, or make sure that we can secure our supply chains. And that's where I think there's some sort of pullback from the Chinese trade, and yet everybody wants to preserve as much good trade and fair trade as possible. So they want a fair and open and inclusive Indo-Pacific. It's really a shared goal, but China is making it very difficult right now from the perspective of, I think, India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. We all share this sort of common concern about how China is using its power, especially Xi Jinping, as he also consolidates unprecedented control internally and looks forward to a third term as General Secretary of the party next year. This is a concern about how China in the future is going to behave, not just on its periphery, but throughout the Indo-Pacific and internationally. That's why the relations here with the Quad are so important. That's why the White House summit is so important, that these four leaders are symbolically coming together saying, we're taking the next step to stand together for a rules-based order that isn't perfectly defined, but we know that we have to work on this together. We can't just let one country unilaterally and coercively rewrite the rules.
Right, and I'm not a fan of Xi Jinping, and I know what you're talking about when you say that he's consolidating his rule, but the fact is that this for instance, the Uyghur crackdown had been happening for years. There's also a
Yes.
criticism that the West uses human rights as a stick to beat countries with once they're on the wrong side of.
Well, I think, I'd push back on that. Yes, the human rights can be inflated or deflated depending on the issue of the time. But I'd say the Uyghur crisis has pretty clearly become a global major humanitarian disaster. And you can say that China pushed back when they had an act of terrorism in 2017, and that sort of escalated their move toward concentration, toward these detention camps and re-education and surveillance state. But they've gone into overdrive in China, in Xinjiang, over the last 4 years, and there's no doubt about that. So it is important for India and the United States and other countries to speak out for people who have no voice in this and who are being hurt, killed, censored, their culture eradicated, whether you call it genocide or not. And there are technical definitions for this, and that's where people can argue over this. The human rights dimension of this is real and tragic.
Right. And for some reason, India has also been called the weak link in the Quad, and India is breaking from tradition in being so obviously and clearly part of an alliance that is being seen as something that should contain China. Of course, the AUKUS has taken the heat off some of that, and it's not being seen as the Asian NATO. We have a new Asian NATO, apparently. But the other player in this equation is Russia. How do you see India's relationship with Russia, the biggest defense partner, and at the same time also a country that is gradually and clearly moving closer to China?
The India-Russia relationship is evolving, and it's gotten more complicated, I think, in recent years. You can see that in Afghanistan, where Russia and India used to be more closely aligned in supporting the Northern Alliance historically. But Russia, its interests are separating a little bit, whether it's on Afghanistan or whether it's China's role in the Indo-Pacific, or whether it's questions of a robust rules-based order. India and Russia are less close than they were historically. I think the relationship is still quite important for India. Russia is a supplier of arms historically, although here too that's starting to change the overall trend line in terms of the U.S. and other Western countries stepping up to help India on defense issues.
Sell. They see India
partner
in the market
together. But also I think there's some concern about how close Russia and China have gotten in recent times, and that's kind of motivating India as well. And so there are elements of continuity and cooperation that are there from that Cold War times, but increasingly there are also elements where the two countries don't see eye to eye on security and other issues.
Right. Before I wrap, then, I want to, as we look forward to this week and what the Indian Prime Minister says and other leaders say, and it'll help us understand which way and which direction India wants to pursue. Is it possible and is it feasible in this current geopolitical scenario to pursue conflicting alliances and make them work?
It is a messy world, and I don't expect it to be cleaned up anytime soon. That's all right. We're not heading again toward necessarily a bipolar Indo-Pacific. It's more this variable geometry that I'm talking about. And you can throw into that mess sort of the multilateral trade agreements, RCEP and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and other arrangements. So there are lots of different ways, including through the ASEAN sort of institutions, for us to work with China and work with Russia even, and also to compete with them. And I think India and the United States and Japan and Australia have an increasing and abiding interest to cooperate on what they believe in and their values and their interests, because if they don't, then it will be made in Beijing by others. And I don't think they want to do that. So that means, yeah, we're not at an alliance yet, but we are moving in closer alignment, but trying to focus on specific problem solving again. The more specific we can be, the more real we can keep quadrilateral action, the more people will see the benefit of it in India, in the United States, and around the world. China, China's foreign minister famously, Wang Yi said that this was nothing but sea foam. Now he says it's a threat. I think maybe the reality is it's somewhere in between. It's not a threat to China, it's not sea foam, it's actually practical cooperation from big four maritime democracies.
Very interesting. Your thoughts before we end. Do you see a shift in India's approach in the week ahead?
Well, I think in general India has been tilting more and more westward because of changes in its immediate security environment. But at the same time, I think India is fairly comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty. I think MEA sees an opportunity to vindicate its interests and extend Indian values through various aspects of partnerships, whether it's the Quad here this week, whether it's the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, whether it's the BRICS. It's about finding ways to advance India's interests. Very quickly on the Quad, this is not so much a hard power defense arrangement against China. This is about pragmatic cooperation that can benefit the peoples of the four countries, and that can also advance the priorities, whether it's COVID-19 and pandemic relief, whether it's dealing with climate change, more resilient supply chains. It's about doing practical stuff that can really address the needs of the people and the people in the broader Indo-Pacific region and the world.
Yes, and yet I think that they need to define their purpose more clearly. Last year they met the foreign ministers. They could not even come up with a joint statement. They said that's not the Quad tradition. I'm hoping we'll see something more than that.
I think we will see some more clarity this week at the White House.
Hopefully.
We saw a first ever Quad joint statement coming out of the first ever virtual leaders interaction. They're meeting together for the first time, making history all together. So I think we're moving in the direction you want to go in.
Let's see. Thank you very much, Atman, Patrick.
Thank you.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.
Gravitas, co-presented by Skoda. Kushak, choose what really matters.